Hey everyone, welcome to Dr. Sleep. We love creating unique content for you, but we need your support now more than ever. Our channel is facing some challenges, and we really need your interaction. If you enjoy what we offer, please subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share our videos with your friends. Every comment, like, and share makes a huge difference. Let's grow together and keep bringing you the content you care about. Thank you for your continued support. The air in the jungle was thick and oppressive, like a damp curtain pressing against their skin. Sam adjusted his backpack, squinting into the sunlight streaming through the dense canopy. "You sure this is worth it?" he asked, glancing at Claire. Her auburn hair clung to her face in the humid air, but her green eyes sparkled with excitement. "It's not every day you get to see something like this," Claire replied, brushing sweat from her forehead. "Besides, it's history, real history." The group trailed behind a wiry guide named Miguel, who spoke in a rapid, almost sing-song cadence. He led them along a narrow path carved into the jungle floor, pointing out bits of pottery or carved stones half buried in the dirt. But it wasn't the official tour that captured Sam and Claire's attention. It was the path they'd glimpsed earlier, veering sharply off the main trail. Miguel noticed their interest and frowned. "That way is not for tourists," he warned, his voice dropping. "The keepers don't like to be disturbed." Sam chuckled. "The keepers?" Miguel's face grew serious. "Statues," he said. "Guardians, cursed by the gods to watch over the ruins. They punish those who trespass." Claire rolled her eyes, but something about Miguel's tone unsettled her. Still, when the group stopped for a break, she and Sam exchanged a glance. They didn't need to say it out loud. They'd come for adventure, and this was it. The side path was overgrown, branches and vines clawing at their clothes as they pushed through. The further they went, the quieter the jungle became. Even the insects seemed to hold their breath. Then they saw it. A clearing surrounded by looming trees where shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally long. At first, Claire thought they were people. The figures stood in various poses, arms raised, heads tilted back, some with hands clawing at their faces. As they stepped closer, the truth hit her. They were statues. Dark stone, mottled with moss and lichen, yet impossibly detailed. Every crease in their clothing, every line etched into their contorted faces, was rendered with uncanny precision. "These are incredible," Sam murmured, pulling out his phone to snap pictures. "It's like you can feel what they felt." Claire shivered. "Terror," she said softly. "That's what they felt." She couldn't look away from one statue in particular, a young woman frozen mid-scream, her hands gripping her throat. The agony in her eyes was palpable, and Claire felt a lump rise in her throat. She glanced around. The clearing was full of them, each one a snapshot of despair. "We should go," she said, her voice tight. Sam hesitated, but finally nodded. "Yeah, okay, let's..." Behind them there was a soft rustling, like dry leaves brushing against stone. Claire whipped around, but the clearing was empty except for the statues. "Come on," she urged, grabbing Sam's arm. As they retreated, neither noticed the statue nearest the path, its head now slightly tilted as if watching them leave. Back at camp, Claire couldn't shake the feeling that they had made a mistake. She kept glancing over her shoulder, half expecting to see something lurking in the shadows. Sam, on the other hand, was unfazed. He scrolled through the photos he'd taken, occasionally showing her an image. "Look at the detail on this one," he said, zooming in on a statue of an older man clutching his chest. "It's incredible. How do you think they made these?" "I don't know," Claire muttered, poking at the lukewarm soup in her bowl. "But something about them isn't right." Sam sighed, setting his phone down. "You heard the guide. It's just a legend to keep people from messing with the ruins. There's nothing to worry about." Claire didn't answer. She couldn't explain it, but the statues had unsettled her in a way she couldn't shake. It wasn't just their lifelike detail. It was the overwhelming sense of dread that seemed to cling to the clearing like a fog. And the sound she'd heard, faint but distinct, like stone scraping against stone. Night fell quickly in the jungle, the dense canopy swallowing the last rays of sunlight. They zipped themselves into their tent, the thin fabric a feeble barrier against the night. Sam fell asleep almost instantly, but Claire lay awake, listening to the symphony of nocturnal insects. She kept telling herself it was just her imagination, but every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig outside made her heart race. Then came the shuffling. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible. A soft, uneven dragging sound, as if something heavy was being pulled through the underbrush. Claire held her breath, straining to listen. The sound grew louder, closer. She shook Sam awake. "What?" he groaned, groggy and irritated. "Listen," she whispered. He sat up, rubbing his eyes. The shuffling stopped. Silence fell over the jungle, so complete it felt oppressive. "I don't hear anything," Sam said, lying back down. "It's just animals. Go to sleep." Claire didn't argue, but she couldn't relax. She sat there, every muscle tensed, until exhaustion finally pulled her under. In the morning, the jungle seemed almost cheerful, the sunlight dappled and warm. Claire felt silly for her fears until they stepped outside the tent. The statues were there. At the edge of their campsite, 3 of them stood in a neat row. Claire recognized them immediately. The young woman with her hands at her throat, the old man clutching his chest, and a third she didn't recall seeing the day before, a child with wide, unblinking eyes. Sam froze, his face pale. "Did someone move these here?" "No one was here," Claire whispered, her voice shaking. "We would have heard." They stared at the statues, their stillness unnerving. Claire couldn't shake the feeling that the eyes of the statues were following them, watching. "We're leaving," she said, her voice firm. Sam didn't argue. Sam and Claire packed up their camp in record time, both too rattled to speak much. Claire's hands trembled as she folded the tent, her eyes darting back to the statues. The way they stood there, motionless but somehow menacing, made her skin crawl. She felt like a child trying to convince herself there were no monsters under the bed. Only this time she knew better. Sam slung his pack over his shoulder, his usual calm demeanor replaced with a quiet urgency. "Let's just get back to the hotel," he muttered. They retraced their steps toward the main trail, but the jungle felt different now. The sunlight seemed dimmer, the air heavier. Every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig made Claire flinch. They didn't speak, each lost in their own thoughts, until Sam stopped abruptly. "Claire," he said, his voice low, "don't freak out." She turned to see what he was looking at and froze. A statue stood in the middle of the path ahead, one they hadn't seen before. It was a man with his arms outstretched, his face twisted into a desperate plea. The detail was so vivid Claire could almost see the tears in his stone eyes. "This wasn't here before," she whispered. "No," Sam agreed. "It wasn't." They edged around the statue, careful not to touch it. Claire felt its presence like a weight on her back as they passed, and she couldn't resist glancing over her shoulder. She wished she hadn't. The statue's head had turned, its face now angled toward her. She gasped, grabbing Sam's arm. It moved. He looked back, his expression skeptical at first, but when he saw the statue, his face went pale. "Let's keep moving," he said, his voice tight. The rest of the hike was a blur. They didn't stop, didn't look back. By the time they reached the tour group, Claire's legs felt like jelly. Miguel raised an eyebrow at their disheveled appearance, but said nothing as they boarded the bus back to the hotel. That night, Claire sat on the bed, scrolling through the photos on her phone. At first, it was comforting to look at them, proof that the statues were just stone, harmless and immobile. But as she flipped through the images, something caught her eye. "Sam," she said, her voice trembling, "look at this." He came over, frowning, as she handed him the phone. The photo showed the clearing where they'd found the statues, but something was wrong. One of the figures, the young woman with her hands at her throat, was facing the camera now. In the next photo, her hands had shifted slightly, clawing at her neck. "That's not possible," Sam said, his voice cracking. Claire shook her head. "It's not just that," she whispered. "Look at the background." Sam zoomed in, his breath catching. Among the trees, half hidden in shadow, were more statues. Dozens of them, all turned toward the couple, waiting. The hotel room felt suffocating, even with the air conditioning humming faintly in the background. Claire paced near the window, glancing outside every few seconds, half expecting to see something lurking in the shadows. Sam sat at the desk staring at the photo on his phone. He hadn't said much since dinner, and the weight of his silence pressed down on her. "We have to go home," Claire said finally, breaking the tension. Whatever this is, it's not normal." Sam nodded, though he didn't look up. "Agreed. We'll call the airline first thing in the morning and see if we can get an earlier flight." Claire exhaled, relieved. "Good. I just want to be somewhere safe." Safe. The word hung in the air like an empty promise. That night, Claire couldn't sleep. She lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling, her mind replaying the events of the day. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the statues, those frozen faces twisted in agony. She kept thinking about the one on the path, its head turned toward her. The image was burned into her mind. Around 2 a.m., a faint noise pulled her from her thoughts, a soft, scraping sound, like stone dragged against wood. Claire froze, her heart pounding in her chest. She strained to listen, but the noise stopped. She told herself it was just her imagination, the remnants of her anxiety playing tricks on her. Then she heard it again. She shook Sam awake, whispering his name urgently. He groaned, sitting up. "What is it?" "Listen," she hissed. The noise came again, louder this time. It was coming from the direction of the window. Sam tensed, his eyes narrowing. He grabbed his phone and switched on the flashlight, the bright beam slicing through the darkness. Slowly he approached the window and pulled back the curtain. "What the—" he started, but the words died in his throat. Claire scrambled out of bed, her stomach sinking. She joined him at the window and her breath caught in her chest. Outside, on the edge of the hotel's courtyard, stood a statue. It was the young woman from the ruins, her hands still clawing at her throat, her face frozen in a scream. "She followed us," Claire whispered, her voice trembling. Sam stumbled back, running a hand through his hair. No, this can't be happening. Someone's messing with us. Someone has to be." "Who?" Claire demanded. "Who would do this, and how?" Neither of them had an answer. They sat awake for the rest of the night, their eyes darting toward the window every few minutes. By morning, the statue was gone. They left for the airport as soon as the sun rose, determined to put as much distance between themselves and the ruins as possible. But as they settled into their seats on the plane, Claire felt no relief. Her heart remained heavy with dread. She couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't leaving the statues behind. The statues were coming with them. By the time they landed, Claire was running on fumes. She couldn't remember the last time she had slept without fear curling in her chest. The flight had been uneventful, but her sense of unease hadn't diminished. If anything, it had grown, sinking into her bones like a chill she couldn't shake. Their house, a modest 2-story in a quiet suburban neighborhood, should have been a refuge. Instead, it felt wrong the moment they stepped through the door. Claire tried to dismiss it as paranoia, a lingering after-effect of their jungle ordeal, but the feeling lingered, a nagging certainty that they hadn't left the statues behind. "I'll grab the bags," Sam said, his voice unusually flat. He had been quieter than usual since the flight, and Claire wasn't sure if it was because he was trying to stay calm for her sake or because he was just as scared. "Okay," she said, moving into the living room. She dropped onto the couch, exhausted, and stared at the blank TV screen. The silence of the house was oppressive, pressing in on her ears. She wished Sam would hurry up and come inside. Then her phone buzzed on the coffee table, startling her so badly she nearly dropped it. She laughed at herself, a hollow sound that didn't even convince her. Picking up the phone, she saw it was a notification from her photo gallery. "Your memories from this day last year," it chirped cheerfully. Claire hesitated before opening it. The first few photos were innocuous, a trip to the beach, smiling selfies with Sam. But as she scrolled, her stomach twisted. The app had pulled in photos from the trip to Mexico. Her finger hovered over one of the images from the ruins. She didn't want to look, but she couldn't help herself. She tapped the picture and it filled the screen. It was the young woman statue, her hands frozen mid-scream. The details were even more vivid on the larger screen. The cracks in her stone skin, the unnatural arch of her neck. Claire's eyes flicked to the background and her breath hitched. Behind the statue, barely visible in the shadows, was another figure. It hadn't been there before. It was smaller, hunched, its features indistinct. Claire dropped the phone onto the couch as if it had burned her. "What's wrong?" Sam asked, coming in with the bags. He froze when he saw her face. "Look," she whispered, pointing at the phone. He picked it up, frowning as he studied the screen. His expression shifted, confusion giving way to fear. "This wasn't here before," he said, his voice barely audible. "I know," Claire said. "Sam, I think they followed us." "That's not possible," he snapped, but the tremor in his voice betrayed him. That night, Claire lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, every muscle tense. Just as she was starting to drift off, she heard it again, the faint, unmistakable sound of stone scraping against wood. The statues weren't just in her photos anymore, they were in the house. The sound of stone scraping against wood was faint but unmistakable, like a knife drawn slowly across a cutting board. Claire sat bolt upright in bed, her breath hitching in her throat. She reached out to shake Sam awake, but he was already sitting up, his eyes wide with alarm. "You heard it too," she whispered. He nodded, his jaw tight. "Stay here," he said, swinging his legs off the bed and grabbing his phone for a flashlight. "Sam, don't," Claire protested, but he was already moving toward the door. She hesitated, then scrambled after him, unwilling to be left alone. The hallway was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the street lamp outside, filtering through the curtains. Sam swept the beam of his flashlight across the walls and floor, his shoulders tense. Nothing moved, but the oppressive silence was worse than the sound had been. They crept toward the living room, their bare feet making no noise on the hardwood floor. As they turned the corner, Claire stifled a gasp. One of the statues was standing in the center of the room. It was the young woman again, her stone hands clawing at her throat, her face frozen in a silent scream. But this time something was different. Her head was tilted ever so slightly, and her eyes seemed to lock onto Claire's. "How did it get here?" Claire whispered, her voice shaking. Sam didn't answer. He approached the statue cautiously, the flashlight trembling in his hand. "Someone's messing with us," he muttered. "They had to bring it in while we were asleep." "Sam, no one else was here," Claire said, backing away. Her gaze flicked to the front door. It was still locked. "It's them. They followed us." Sam circled the statue, his breath coming in short, sharp bursts. "It's just stone," he said, almost to himself. "It's just a statue. It can't—" The light flickered, plunging the room into darkness. Claire let out a small cry, fumbling for her phone. When she turned on her own flashlight, her heart dropped. The statue was closer. It was still frozen in place, but now it was only a few feet away from her. "Sam," she said, her voice barely audible. He was staring at it too, his face pale and drawn. Slowly, he reached out a hand as if to touch it. "Don't," Claire hissed, grabbing his arm. The light flickered again, and when it came back, the statue was gone. Claire let out a shaky breath, her eyes darting around the room. Where did it go? They turned, and there it was, standing in the doorway to the kitchen. Its face was tilted down now, as though it were staring directly at them. "We need to get out of here," Claire said, her voice breaking. Sam nodded, his resolve crumbling. They backed toward the door, their eyes never leaving the statue. Claire reached for the handle, her hands trembling so badly she could barely grip it. As the door swung open, the faintest sound reached their ears, the grinding of stone and something that almost sounded like their names. They stumbled into the cold night air, slamming the door behind them. Claire leaned against the car, her breath coming in panicked gasps. Sam fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking too badly to fit them into the lock. "Hurry!" Claire hissed, her eyes darting to the house. The windows were dark, but that only made it worse. She half expected to see the young woman's statue pressed against the glass, its frozen face watching them. Finally, the car unlocked. They climbed in, and Sam started the engine. As the headlights flickered on, their beams swept across the front lawn and caught something that made Claire's blood run cold. There were statues, 4 of them now, standing in a loose semicircle. The young woman, the old man clutching his chest, the child with the wide, unblinking eyes, and a new figure, a man with his arms outstretched as though reaching for them. "Drive!" Claire screamed, gripping Sam's arm. He didn't need to be told twice. The car lurched forward, tires spinning on the gravel driveway before finding traction. They sped down the quiet suburban street, leaving their house and the statues behind. For a few minutes, the only sound was the hum of the engine and Claire's ragged breathing. Sam glanced in the rearview mirror, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. "Do you see them?" he asked, his voice strained. Claire turned, her heart hammering. The street was empty. "No," she said, her voice shaky. "I think we lost them." Sam exhaled, but the tension in his shoulders didn't ease. "We need to figure out what's happening. It's not normal." "You think?" Claire snapped, her fear boiling over into anger. "Statues don't just follow people home, Sam. They don't move when you're not looking. This isn't supposed to happen." "I know," he shouted, slamming his hand against the steering wheel. "But what are we supposed to do? Call the cops and tell them statues are stalking us?" Claire fell silent, her chest heaving. He was right. Who would believe them? Even she could barely wrap her head around it. But she knew one thing. They couldn't go back home. They drove aimlessly for hours, the city blurring into a monotonous stretch of gas stations and empty parking lots. Finally, they pulled into the lot of a cheap motel. Sam checked them in while Claire waited in the car, her eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. The room was dingy but quiet, and for a moment Claire thought they might be safe. She collapsed onto the bed, too exhausted to care about the stained sheets. Sam sat at the edge, his head in his hands. "We need answers," he said finally. "Something started this. Maybe if we figure out what, we can stop it." Claire nodded, though she wasn't sure she believed it. All she could think about were the statues, the way they moved, the way they whispered their names, and the growing certainty that no matter how far they ran, they wouldn't escape. That night, as Claire drifted into a fitful sleep, she dreamed of stone faces and grinding whispers. When she woke, the chair in the corner of the room wasn't empty anymore. The young woman statue was sitting there, its head tilted, its eyes locked on hers. Claire screamed, scrambling back against the headboard. The sound jolted Sam awake, and his eyes followed hers to the chair in the corner. The statue was unmistakable. The young woman with her hands clawing at her throat, her stone face locked in an eternal scream. But now she wasn't outside. She was in the room with them. "Get up," Claire gasped, her voice trembling. "We have to go." Sam leapt to his feet, grabbing his phone for light. "How did it get in here?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I don't care," Claire snapped. "We're leaving." They inched toward the door, their eyes never leaving the statue. Its stillness was almost worse than if it had moved. It felt like a coiled snake, ready to strike the moment they turned away. Sam reached for the doorknob, but Claire grabbed his arm. "Wait," she said, her voice hushed. "Listen." The faint grinding of stone against stone filled the room, so soft it was almost imperceptible. Then came the whispering, low and guttural, like wind slipping through cracks in ancient walls. Their names were clear this time, twisted and distorted, as if dragged over rough surfaces. "Claire, Sam, soon." Sam yanked the door open, and they bolted into the night. The cold air hit them like a slap, but they didn't stop running until they were in the car. Sam started the engine, and the tires squealed as they sped out of the motel parking lot. "We can't keep running," Claire said, her voice breaking. "They'll keep following us, no matter where we go." "Then what do we do?" Sam shouted. "You want to just give up?" Claire pressed her hands to her temples, trying to think. Her mind raced, pulling at fragments of memory. The statues, the ruins, the eerie stillness of the clearing. The guide's warning echoed in her head. The keepers don't like to be disturbed. "We have to go back," she said suddenly. "What?" Sam snapped, glancing at her like she'd lost her mind. "The ruins," Claire said, her voice steadying. "This all started there. Maybe if we return, we can fix it, undo whatever we did." Sam gritted his teeth but didn't argue. He turned the car onto the highway, heading south. The drive back to the airport was a blur of exhaustion and fear. Every shadow on the road, every flicker of movement at the edge of their vision, felt like a harbinger of the statues. Claire's phone vibrated periodically with photo notifications, images of the statues appearing in places they had never been. By the time they landed in Mexico, they were both on edge, their nerves frayed to breaking. They rented a car and drove back into the jungle, the dense greenery closing in around them like a shroud. The statues didn't appear during the drive, but the feeling of being watched never left. When they reached the ruins, the jungle was deathly silent. Even the insects seemed to avoid the clearing. Claire and Sam stood at the edge, their eyes scanning the statues, which were now exactly as they had been when they first found them. But something was different. There were more of them now. Among the new additions, Claire spotted a familiar figure, a hunched man, his stone face twisted in fear. It was Miguel, the guide. Claire staggered backward, her breath catching in her throat. "It's Miguel," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Oh my God, it's him!" Sam's jaw tightened as he stared at the statue of their former guide. Miguel's face was frozen in terror, his hands outstretched, as if he had tried to fend something off. The detail was as vivid as it had been for the others, the anguish in his eyes, the strain in his muscles, even the beads of sweat on his stone skin. "This is what happens," Claire said, her voice shaking. "This is what they do. If we don't stop this, we'll be next." Sam's hands curled into fists, his eyes scanning the clearing. "How? How do we stop it?" Claire pulled out the piece of paper the old villager had given them earlier, a hastily scrawled set of instructions and an incantation in a language neither of them understood. The woman had insisted it was the only way to appease the statues and break the curse. "We light the fire," Claire said, pointing to the circle of blackened stones in the center of the clearing. "And we say this: she said it would work." "She also said people don't come back from this," Sam muttered. But he didn't argue. He grabbed his lighter and began gathering wood while Claire set the paper on a flat stone nearby, her hands trembling as she smoothed it out. The jungle seemed to close in around them, the silence almost deafening. The air grew colder, and the oppressive weight Claire had felt since leaving the ruins returned tenfold. She glanced at the statues, half expecting them to move. But they remained still, their stony gazes locked on her and Sam. Finally, the fire roared to life, casting flickering light and long shadows across the clearing. Claire picked up the paper and began to read, her voice unsteady at first but growing stronger. The words felt strange in her mouth, as if they weren't meant to be spoken by human tongues. As she chanted, the ground beneath them seemed to vibrate, a low hum that resonated in their bones. The statues remained still, but the air around them shimmered like heat waves. The whispers began again, faint at first but growing louder, overlapping and echoing until it became impossible to distinguish one voice from another. "Claire, Sam, stay." "Keep going," Sam shouted, his eyes darting around the clearing. He held a thick branch from the fire like a weapon, as if it could protect them from the encroaching dread. The whispers turned into a cacophony, and the fire began to flicker, its flames bending unnaturally toward the statues. One by one, the figures began to shift. It was subtle at first, a finger twitching, a head tilting. Then they started to move. "They're coming," Sam yelled, backing toward Claire. The statues lurched forward, their movements jerky and unnatural, as if they were learning how to walk. Claire's voice faltered as the young woman's statue stepped into the firelight, her stone mouth stretching into an agonizing scream. "Finish it," Sam shouted, swinging the burning branch at the advancing statues. Claire screamed the final words of the incantation, her voice breaking as the fire erupted in a blinding flash of light. The clearing was consumed in a searing white glow, and the whispers stopped. When the light faded, the statues were gone. The clearing was silent, save for the crackling embers of the dying fire. Claire collapsed to her knees, her body trembling with exhaustion. Sam stood beside her, his face pale and drenched with sweat, the smoldering branch still clutched in his hand. "They're gone," Claire whispered, her voice hoarse. "It worked." Sam's gaze swept across the empty clearing, his eyes lingering on the places where the statues had once stood. The oppressive atmosphere had lifted, but an eerie stillness remained, as if the jungle itself was holding its breath. "Let's get out of here," Sam said finally, helping Claire to her feet. "We're not staying a second longer." They stumbled back to their car, the trail seeming longer and darker than before. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves made Claire jump, but no statues appeared. By the time they reached the car, the first rays of dawn were breaking through the trees, bathing the jungle in golden light. For the first time in days, Claire felt a glimmer of hope. The drive back to the airport was quiet. Neither of them spoke, their minds too heavy with what they had endured. Claire leaned her head against the window, watching the jungle recede into the distance. She didn't feel relief, not really. The fear still clung to her like a shadow. When they finally boarded their flight and the plane lifted off, Claire closed her eyes and exhaled. They were leaving it all behind, the statues, the ruins, the whispers. It was over, or so she thought. 2 weeks later, Claire stood in her kitchen, absently stirring a cup of tea. The house had been quiet since they returned. Too quiet. Sam insisted they'd left the curse behind, but Claire couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her. She kept the lights on at night, double-checked every lock, and avoided looking too long at shadows. She glanced at her phone, which was lying face up on the counter. A notification blinked on the screen. "New memory created for you." Claire's stomach twisted. She hadn't been able to bring herself to delete the photos from their trip, even though she knew she should. Her thumb hovered over the notification before she tapped it. The app opened to a photo from the ruins, the young woman statue, her hands clawing at her throat. Claire's chest tightened as she stared at the image, her eyes drifting to the background. At first, she thought it was her imagination, but then she saw it clearly. In the shadows behind the statue was another figure. It wasn't there before. It was Sam. Her hands trembled, and the phone slipped from her grasp, clattering onto the counter. She stumbled into the living room, calling his name. "Sam, where are you?" There was no answer. She froze. In the corner of the room stood a new statue, a man with his arms outstretched, his face twisted in fear. The detail was unmistakable. It was Sam. Claire screamed, backing away. Behind her, she heard the faint scrape of stone on wood. Turning slowly, she saw the young woman statue standing in the doorway, her stone lips curling into a whisper only Claire could hear. "Soon." It all started innocently enough. I had always been curious about the darker corners of the internet, the hidden layers that most people don't dare to explore. I was a tech-savvy college student with too much time on my hands and a penchant for conspiracy theories. Little did I know this curiosity would lead me down a path I could never have imagined. One evening, after finishing my assignments, I decided to dive into the dark web. I had a pretty secure setup, a VPN, Tor browser, and the works. I wasn't looking for anything specific, just browsing through various forums and marketplaces, hoping to stumble upon something intriguing. After about an hour of aimless wandering, I found a forum thread titled "The Truth About Extraterrestrial Life, Government Cover-Ups, and Hidden Bases." The post had only a few replies, and the author seemed adamant about having solid proof of an alien conspiracy. My interest piqued. I clicked on the thread. The post contained a series of links to encrypted files, and the author, who went by the username AlienHunter42, claimed these files held undeniable evidence of extraterrestrial life and a hidden government base. I was skeptical but intrigued. I downloaded the files and started decrypting them. It took a while, but eventually, I managed to open the first document. What I saw sent chills down my spine. It was a series of government documents heavily redacted but clearly referencing Project Nexus, an alleged initiative involving alien technology and genetic experimentation. There were also coordinates to a supposed underground base in the middle of nowhere. I spent the next few days poring over the documents, cross-referencing them with other conspiracy theories and legitimate sources. The more I read, the more convinced I became that there was something real behind all this. I decided to share my findings on a more secure forum, hoping to get input from other conspiracy enthusiasts. Within hours of posting, my thread blew up. Some users dismissed it as a hoax, but others seemed genuinely interested and provided additional information that corroborated my findings. One user, DeepThroat7, claimed to be a former government employee and warned me to stop digging. He said I was playing with fire and that the men in black wouldn't take kindly to my curiosity. I shrugged it off as paranoia and continued my research. But then, strange things started happening. My laptop, which was always reliable, began acting up. Files disappeared, and my internet connection would drop at random. At first I thought it was just a coincidence, but then I noticed the black SUVs. It started with one parked across the street from my apartment. Then there were two. Then three. The men inside wore black suits and sunglasses, their faces expressionless as they watched my building. I tried to convince myself it was all in my head, but deep down, I knew I had crossed a line. One night, as I was working late, I heard a knock on my door. My heart raced as I peered through the peephole. Two men in black suits stood outside, their faces stern. Panic set in, and I quickly turned off all the lights, hoping they would think I wasn't home. "Mr. Johnson, we know you're in there," one of them called out. "We just want to talk." I didn't respond. Instead, I grabbed my laptop and the encrypted files and slipped out the back window. I ran through the alley, my mind racing with fear and adrenaline. I could hear them following me, their footsteps echoing in the night. I managed to lose them in the maze of alleys and made my way to a friend's house. I explained everything to him, and he let me stay the night. We spent hours trying to figure out what to do next. I was in too deep, and it was clear that whoever these men were, they wouldn't stop until they got what they wanted. The next morning, my friend and I decided it was best if I left town for a while. I packed a bag with essentials and took my laptop and files. As I drove out of the city, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every black SUV I passed made my heart skip a beat. I found a small motel in a remote town and checked in under a fake name. I spent the next few days trying to piece together my findings and come up with a plan. But the more I uncovered, the more dangerous it became. The documents hinted at experiments, abductions, and a plan that could change the world as we know it. One night, as I was going through the files again, I heard a commotion outside. Peeking through the curtains, I saw a convoy of black SUVs pulling into the motel parking lot. My heart pounded as I realized they had found me. I grabbed my things and slipped out the back door, my mind racing. I knew I couldn't keep running forever, but I had to find a way to expose the truth without getting caught. As I disappeared into the night, I vowed to uncover the full extent of the alien plot and the government's involvement. Little did I know this was just the beginning of my nightmare. After barely escaping the motel, I found myself on the run, constantly looking over my shoulder. I drove aimlessly for hours, trying to distance myself from the men in black suits. I eventually found a small, secluded cabin in the woods that seemed abandoned. It wasn't much, but it offered me a place to hide and regroup. The first thing I did was set up a secure connection on my laptop. I couldn't afford to be careless. These people had resources and technology far beyond my understanding. Once I was sure my connection was secure, I reached out to a few trusted contacts online, explaining my situation and seeking their advice. One of them, an old friend from my hacking days, suggested I go completely off the grid and only use encrypted communication methods. He also offered to help me analyze the files further. With my friend's help, we discovered even more disturbing information. The documents detailed not only the existence of the underground base, but also its purpose. The government had been working with extraterrestrial beings for decades, conducting experiments that defied ethical boundaries. The base was a hub for genetic manipulation, where both human and alien DNA were being combined to create hybrid beings. The ultimate goal was to use this technology to gain control over the population. The more we uncovered, the more we realized the gravity of the situation. We needed concrete evidence to expose this conspiracy to the world. My friend suggested we find a whistleblower, someone from the inside who could confirm our findings. He connected me with a former employee of Project Nexus who was willing to talk. We arranged a meeting at a safe location, a small diner off a highway, far from any major city. I arrived early, nervously scanning the area for any signs of surveillance. The diner was nearly empty, just a few truckers grabbing a late-night meal. I took a seat in a corner booth, my back to the wall, and waited. A few minutes later, a middle-aged man in a worn-out jacket walked in. He looked around cautiously before making his way to my table. "Are you Johnson?" he asked in a low voice, sliding into the seat opposite me. I nodded. "Yeah, thanks for meeting me." He glanced around again before leaning in. "I don't have much time, they're watching me too." "Tell me what you know," I urged, keeping my voice steady despite the fear gnawing at my insides. He took a deep breath. Project Nexus is real, and it's worse than you can imagine. They've been experimenting on people, taking them from their homes and erasing their memories. The hybrids, they're unstable, dangerous. The government plans to use them as a means of control to suppress any opposition. Why hasn't anyone come forward before? I asked, my mind racing with the implications. Most of us are too scared. They have ways of making people disappear, he replied grimly. But you've stirred the pot. They won't stop until they have you. Before I could ask more, he suddenly stiffened, his eyes widening in fear. They're here, he whispered, his face paling. You need to run. Now. Without another word, he stood up and hurried out of the diner. I followed suit, leaving money on the table and slipping out the back door. Sure enough, 2 black SUVs were parked outside, men in black suits emerging from them, scanning the area. My heart pounded as I darted into the nearby woods, hoping the darkness would conceal me. I ran for what felt like hours, the branches and underbrush scratching my skin. I finally stopped to catch my breath, crouching behind a large tree. I listened intently, but all I could hear were the distant sounds of the forest. It seemed I had managed to lose them, at least for now. As I sat there trying to calm my racing heart, I realized that running wasn't enough. I needed to go on the offensive, to expose this conspiracy before it was too late. But how? I was just one person against a powerful organization with endless resources. Then it hit me. The dark web. It was the very place where I had discovered this nightmare, and it could be the key to exposing it. I decided to gather all the evidence I had, encrypt it, and share it with as many people as possible. If enough people knew the truth, the government wouldn't be able to silence us all. With renewed determination, I made my way back to the cabin. I spent the next few days compiling everything, creating multiple backups and setting up secure channels to disseminate the information. I reached out to my contacts, urging them to share the evidence far and wide. But even as I worked tirelessly, I knew the men in black were closing in. Time was running out, and the stakes had never been higher. The truth was out there, and it was up to me to make sure the world knew it. As I hit send on the final batch of files, I heard the distant hum of engines. My heart sank. They had found me again, but this time I was ready. Grabbing my essentials, I slipped out the back door and disappeared into the night, determined to stay one step ahead of them. The chase was far from over, but I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't alone anymore. The world was waking up, and the truth would not be silenced. I spent the next few days moving from place to place, never staying in one location for too long. The black SUVs and men in black suits were always on my trail, but I managed to stay one step ahead of them. The files I had sent out started gaining traction, and I began receiving messages from people all over the world who believed me and wanted to help. One message stood out from the rest. It was from someone named Whisper, who claimed to have inside information and could provide a safe haven. Whisper directed me to an old farmhouse on the outskirts of a small town. Desperate and running out of options, I decided to take the risk. I arrived at the farmhouse just after sunset, the sky painted with hues of orange and purple. The place looked abandoned, with overgrown weeds and broken windows, but I had no choice. I knocked on the door, and a moment later, it creaked open. A woman in her early 30s stood there, her eyes cautious but kind. "You must be Johnson," she said, stepping aside to let me in. "I'm Whisper." The farmhouse was surprisingly well kept inside, a stark contrast to its exterior. Whisper led me to a cozy living room where an old laptop sat on a wooden table. "I've been following your story," she said, offering me a seat. "And I believe you." Relief washed over me as I sank into the chair. "Thank you. I didn't know where else to go." Whisper nodded. "I used to work for them," she said quietly. "I know what they're capable of, but I got out, and I've been helping people like you ever since." She showed me her setup: secure servers, encrypted communication channels, and a network of informants. Whisper had been collecting evidence for years, waiting for the right moment to expose the truth. With my files and her resources, we had a real chance. Over the next few days, Whisper and I worked tirelessly. We cross-referenced our information, piecing together the full extent of the alien plot and the government's involvement. The documents revealed shocking details about Project Nexus, including a list of abductees and the locations of several hidden bases. One night, while we were deep in our research, Whisper received a message on her secure channel. It was from a whistleblower within the government who had seen our files and wanted to help. They provided us with a crucial piece of information: the exact location of the main underground base and the security protocols to get inside. "This is it," Whisper said, her eyes wide with determination. "We have to go there and get concrete evidence, photos, videos, anything that will prove our story beyond a doubt." The thought of infiltrating a heavily guarded underground base terrified me, but I knew she was right. This was our chance to expose the truth once and for all. We spent the next few days planning our mission, gathering supplies, and preparing for every possible scenario. Finally, the day came. Dressed in dark clothing and armed with nothing but our wits and a few gadgets, we set out for the base. It was located in a remote area deep within a forest. The journey was tense, every rustle of leaves and snap of a twig setting my nerves on edge. As we approached the coordinates, we saw the entrance, a heavily guarded gate with surveillance cameras and armed guards. Whisper activated a device that jammed the cameras temporarily, giving us a narrow window to slip through the fence and into the base. Inside, the air was cold and sterile. The corridors were lined with metal doors, each marked with a code. Whisper led the way, using the information from the whistleblower to navigate the maze-like structure. We finally reached a large reinforced door labeled Lab 3. Taking a deep breath, Whisper entered the access code. The door slid open with a hiss, revealing a vast laboratory filled with advanced equipment and large containment units. Inside the units were what looked like hybrid beings, a mix of human and alien DNA. My stomach churned at the sight. We quickly set to work, taking photos and videos of everything. Whisper accessed the main computer terminal, downloading critical files onto a secure drive. Suddenly, an alarm blared, and red lights flashed. We had been detected. "We need to go now," Whisper shouted, grabbing the drive. We sprinted through the corridors, the sound of heavy footsteps and barking orders echoing behind us. The guards were closing in. We reached the exit just as the guards rounded the corner, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. Outside, we ran into the forest, the guards hot on our trail. We knew we couldn't outrun them for long. Whisper handed me the drive. "Take this and get to the rendezvous point. I'll lead them away." "No, we stick together," I protested, but she shook her head. "They need you to expose the truth. Go." Reluctantly, I took the drive and ran in the opposite direction. I could hear the guards following Whisper, their shouts fading into the distance. I kept running until I reached the edge of the forest, where an old pickup truck waited. I climbed in and started the engine, my hands shaking. As I drove away, I couldn't help but worry about Whisper. She had risked everything to help me, and now it was up to me to finish what we had started. With the evidence in hand, I headed to the nearest town, determined to upload the files and share our story with the world. The truth was out there, and it was time for everyone to know. I drove through the night, every shadow and headlight making me jump. The pickup truck rattled down the highway, carrying the weight of the truth with it. I knew that Whisper had sacrificed her safety for this mission, and I couldn't let her down. I needed to find a secure place to upload the evidence. I reached a small town just before dawn. It was quiet, the streets empty, and the shops still closed. I parked the truck behind a diner and made my way to a public library, hoping it would be open early. As luck would have it, the doors were just being unlocked by a sleepy-looking librarian. I entered, trying to appear as inconspicuous as possible. The librarian gave me a polite nod as I made my way to the computer section. I chose a computer in the corner, away from prying eyes, and connected the secure drive. My hands trembled as I began the upload process, knowing that this was it, the moment of truth. The files were large and took time to upload, each second feeling like an eternity. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting the men in black to burst in at any moment. When the upload finally completed, I sent the links to every contact I had and posted them on multiple forums and social media platforms. I also sent a copy to several news outlets, hoping that at least one of them would take it seriously. I spent the rest of the day at the library, monitoring the responses. The initial reaction was a mix of disbelief, shock, and curiosity. Some people dismissed it as a hoax, but others began to dig deeper, verifying the documents and sharing the information. News outlets started picking up the story, and soon it was spreading like wildfire. By evening, my phone was buzzing with messages and calls from journalists, conspiracy theorists, and ordinary people who wanted to know more. I gave a few anonymous interviews, careful not to reveal my location. The truth was out there now, and there was no turning back. As night fell, I decided to leave the library and find a safer place to stay. I was exhausted, my body aching from the stress and lack of sleep. I found a small bed and breakfast on the outskirts of town and checked in under a fake name. The owner, an elderly woman, gave me a warm smile and showed me to a cozy room with a view of the garden. That night, I slept fitfully, my dreams filled with images of aliens, underground bases, and Whisper's face urging me to keep going. When I woke up, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. The world was beginning to understand the gravity of what we had uncovered, and I needed to ensure the momentum continued. I spent the next few days coordinating with other whistleblowers and activists online. The evidence was irrefutable, and more people were coming forward with their own experiences and information. We began to organize a virtual conference, inviting experts, journalists, and former government employees to discuss the implications of the alien plot and the government's involvement. The conference was a success, drawing thousands of viewers from around the world. People were finally waking up to the reality of the situation, demanding answers and accountability. The government could no longer hide behind secrecy and denial. During one of the panel discussions, a familiar face appeared on the screen, Whisper. She had managed to evade capture and was broadcasting from a secure location. Her voice was calm but firm as she shared her story and the sacrifices she had made to bring the truth to light. Seeing her alive and well gave me hope and strengthened my resolve. But just as things seemed to be turning in our favor, a new challenge emerged. The government issued a statement denying all the allegations, calling the evidence fabricated, and labeling us as conspiracy theorists and criminals. They announced a crackdown on misinformation, threatening legal action against anyone spreading the story. The men in black suits and SUVs were back, this time more determined than ever. I knew I had to be even more careful, constantly changing locations and using secure communication methods. Despite the government's efforts to discredit us, the truth continued to spread, and more people began to question the official narrative. One evening, as I was preparing to move to yet another safe house, I received an encrypted message from Whisper. She had uncovered something even more shocking, a plan to deploy the hybrid beings as a means of population control. The government was planning a staged alien invasion to justify the use of these hybrids, creating chaos and fear to consolidate their power. We needed to act quickly. Whisper and I devised a plan to hack into a live government broadcast and reveal the evidence to the world in real time. It was risky, but it was our best shot at stopping the plan and exposing the truth once and for all. The day of the broadcast arrived, and my nerves were on edge. Whisper guided me through the process, her voice steady and reassuring. As the government officials began their carefully scripted speech, we executed the hack. The screen flickered, and then the evidence we had gathered appeared for all to see. The reaction was immediate. People across the country and around the world watched in shock as the truth unfolded before their eyes. The government's lies were laid bare, and the public demanded justice. But the fight was far from over. The men in black would stop at nothing to silence us, and we had to stay vigilant. Whisper and I continued to work in the shadows, determined to see this through to the end. As I moved to yet another safe house, I couldn't help but feel a glimmer of hope. The world was changing, and the truth was finally coming to light. We had taken the first step in a long and dangerous journey, but I knew that together we could make a difference. The truth was out there, and it would not be silenced. The world was a different place after the live broadcast. The evidence of the alien plot and the government's involvement was undeniable. Protests erupted in cities across the globe, demanding transparency and accountability. The public's outrage was palpable, and the government could no longer dismiss us as mere conspiracy theorists. But with the truth out in the open, the danger was far from over. The men in black suits and SUVs intensified their efforts to find and silence Whisper and me. We knew we had to stay one step ahead of them, but we also realized that our best chance of survival was to keep the pressure on the government. Whisper and I continued our work from the shadows, coordinating with other activists and whistleblowers. We shared information, strategized, and planned our next moves. The public was on our side now, and that gave us strength. The truth had given people hope, and they were ready to fight for their future. One evening, as I sat in a dimly lit room at yet another safe house, I received an urgent message from Whisper. She had uncovered a crucial piece of information: the location of a secret meeting between top government officials and representatives of the extraterrestrial beings. This meeting was to finalize the plan to deploy the hybrid beings and stage the fake invasion. "We have to expose this meeting," Whisper said, her voice crackling over the encrypted line. "If we can capture evidence of the government's collusion with the aliens, it will be the final nail in their coffin." The meeting was set to take place in a remote, heavily guarded facility. Whisper and I spent hours planning our approach. We knew this would be our most dangerous mission yet, but we had no choice. The fate of humanity depended on it. The night of the meeting, Whisper and I made our way to the facility, using every trick we knew to avoid detection. We managed to slip past the perimeter guards and make our way inside. The facility was a maze of corridors and security checkpoints, but Whisper had obtained a layout of the building, and we navigated it with precision. We reached the conference room just as the meeting was starting. Peeking through a small vent, we saw a group of high-ranking officials seated around a large table, with a few strange humanoid figures standing nearby. The sight of the extraterrestrials sent a chill down my spine, but I forced myself to focus. Whisper set up a hidden camera, broadcasting the meeting live to our secure network. The officials discussed their plans in detail, openly acknowledging their partnership with the aliens and their intention to use the hybrids to control the population. It was more horrifying than we had imagined, but we had the evidence we needed. As the meeting continued, we began our retreat, knowing we had to get out before the guards discovered us. But just as we were about to leave, an alarm blared. We had been detected. Panic set in as we ran through the corridors, the sound of footsteps and shouting voices closing in behind us. We reached the exit, only to find it blocked by a group of men in black suits. Whisper and I looked at each other, knowing this could be the end. But then something incredible happened. A group of protesters, tipped off by our broadcast, had gathered outside the facility. They stormed the entrance, overwhelming the guards and creating a diversion. Whisper and I seized the opportunity and slipped out in the chaos. The protesters' bravery had saved us, and we knew we had to keep fighting. We regrouped with our allies and continued to spread the truth, rallying more support and putting constant pressure on the government. The fallout from the exposed meeting was immediate. The public was outraged, and the government officials involved were forced to resign. Investigations were launched, and the collusion with extraterrestrial beings was confirmed. The hybrids were dismantled, and the plan for the staged invasion was abandoned. Whisper and I became symbols of resistance, but we knew it wasn't about us. It was about the truth and the people who fought for it. The world was changing, and while the fight was far from over, we had made a significant impact. In the months that followed, reforms were implemented to ensure transparency and accountability. The government's secrets were laid bare and the people regained their power. Whisper and I continued our work, always vigilant, always ready to uncover the next hidden truth. As I sat in yet another safe house looking out at the dawn of a new day, I felt a sense of hope. The world was waking up and the truth was finally coming to light. The journey had been long and perilous, but we had made a difference. The truth was out there, and it would never be silenced again. Hey everyone, this is something I never thought I'd be sharing online, let alone with strangers. But after what's happened, I feel like I need to get it off my chest. Maybe someone out there can make sense of it all. I'll start from the beginning. So it was a regular Friday night, and I was home alone. My parents were out for the weekend, and my younger sister was at a sleepover. I had the house to myself, which meant I could finally catch up on some of my favorite shows and maybe play a bit of online poker. Around midnight, after watching a couple of episodes of Stranger Things, I decided to browse the internet for something different. I've always had a fascination with the unknown, UFOs, paranormal activities, you name it. I don't consider myself a conspiracy theorist, but I do enjoy reading about all the strange stuff out there. That night, I found myself going deeper into the rabbit hole than usual. I ended up on some obscure forums where people were sharing their supposed encounters with extraterrestrial beings. It was all pretty entertaining until I stumbled upon a thread about the dark web. Curiosity got the better of me, and I followed the links provided. Now I know what you're thinking. The dark web is dangerous and should be avoided. But honestly, I wasn't planning on buying anything illegal or getting involved in shady business. I just wanted to see what all the fuss was about. After some fumbling around with Tor and a few tutorials, I found myself on a marketplace. It was surprisingly organized, with categories for all sorts of illegal goods and services. But what caught my eye was a section titled Occult and Paranormal. I clicked on it, and there it was, an ebook titled A Guide to Summoning Aliens. The description was brief and promised a detailed step-by-step process to communicate and even summon extraterrestrial beings. It was going for about $50 in Bitcoin. It seemed like a joke, but my curiosity was piqued. I didn't think twice. I transferred the Bitcoin and downloaded the file. The ebook was about 50 pages long, filled with all sorts of instructions, diagrams, and symbols. It felt like a mix between an ancient spellbook and a modern manual. The introduction warned that the process wasn't for the faint-hearted and that the summoner should proceed with caution. It also mentioned that the ritual could have unpredictable results. I was intrigued but also skeptical. Over the next few days, I read the ebook cover to cover. Most of it seemed like nonsense, but there were some parts that made me uneasy. There were warnings about physical and psychological effects, and the author claimed to have had direct contact with extraterrestrial beings. One night, out of sheer boredom and curiosity, I decided to give it a try. The instructions were simple but specific. I needed to prepare a secluded space, preferably outdoors, and draw certain symbols on the ground. I also needed a few items: a candle, a mirror, and a piece of quartz. Luckily, my backyard was pretty secluded, with a small clearing near the woods. I gathered the items and headed out around midnight. It was eerily quiet, with only the sound of crickets and the occasional rustling of leaves. Following the instructions, I drew the symbols on the ground using some chalk. They looked like a mix of geometric shapes and strange runes. I placed the candle in the center, with the mirror facing the sky and the quartz on top of it. I lit the candle and started chanting the words written in the book. The chant was in a language I didn't recognize, and it felt strange rolling off my tongue. As I continued, the air around me seemed to grow colder, and a sense of unease settled over me. Nothing happened at first. I felt a bit foolish standing there in the dark chanting to the sky. But then the candle flickered and I heard a low hum. It started faintly, almost like a distant engine, but it grew louder and more intense. The mirror began to vibrate, and I could see faint lights reflecting in it, lights that weren't coming from the candle. The hum turned into a high-pitched whine, and I felt a pressure building in my ears. Then, everything went silent. The candle went out and the lights vanished. I was left standing in the dark, my heart pounding in my chest. I quickly packed up my things and hurried back inside, locking the doors behind me. That night I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those lights and heard that hum. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination. But deep down, I knew something had happened. The next day, things got even stranger. I started noticing odd things around the house. Objects moved from their usual places, strange symbols appearing on my bedroom window, and an unsettling feeling of being watched. I've been trying to document everything, but I'm not sure what to do next. Should I continue with the ritual or stop before things get worse? Part of me wants to see this through, but another part is terrified of what I might uncover. If anyone has any advice or similar experiences, please let me know. I'll keep you updated on what happens next. For now, I'm just hoping I haven't opened a door that can't be closed. Hey everyone, thanks for all the support and advice on my last post. I didn't expect such a response, and it's comforting to know that I'm not alone in this. A lot has happened since I shared part 1, and I'm ready to continue the story. If you haven't read the first part, I suggest you do to get the full context. So, after that eerie night in the backyard, I tried to go about my daily life. But it was hard to shake off the feeling that something was watching me. The odd occurrences around the house didn't stop. In fact, they seemed to intensify. A few days after the ritual, I was sitting in the living room when I noticed something peculiar. The TV, which was turned off, flickered to life for a brief moment, displaying nothing but static. I grabbed the remote, but before I could do anything, the screen went black again. I shrugged it off as a glitch, but then it happened again. This time, the static wasn't just noise. It formed patterns, almost like symbols similar to the ones I drew during the ritual. I quickly grabbed my phone and took a picture of the screen. When I compared it to the symbols in the ebook, my suspicion was confirmed. They were the same. This couldn't be a coincidence. I felt a chill run down my spine. Later that night, as I lay in bed, I heard a faint tapping sound on my window. It was a calm night with no wind, so I knew it wasn't a branch or anything natural. I tried to ignore it, but the tapping grew louder and more insistent. Gathering my courage, I walked over to the window and peered outside. What I saw made my blood run cold. There, etched into the condensation on the window, were the same symbols from the ebook and the TV. I backed away slowly, my mind racing. Who or what was doing this? I knew I needed to figure out what was happening, so I decided to revisit the ebook. There was a section I had skimmed over initially, titled Signs of Contact. The author described various phenomena that indicated successful communication with extraterrestrial beings, flickering lights, strange symbols, and a sense of being watched. I was experiencing all of these. The next part of the guide detailed how to enhance communication and potentially summon an alien being. It required a more elaborate setup and another chant, different from the first one. The instructions emphasized the importance of not doing this alone and being mentally prepared for whatever might happen. I decided to confide in my best friend, Mark. We've known each other since elementary school, and if anyone would believe me, it would be him. When I told him about the ritual and the strange occurrences, he was skeptical at first, but after I showed him the ebook and the pictures of the symbols, he agreed to help. We chose the next Friday night for the second ritual. Mark came over, and we set up in the backyard again. This time, we added a few more items as per the guide. Salt to form a protective circle, a second candle, and a piece of iron. The chant was more complex, and we had to say it in unison. As we began, I felt the same eerie coldness in the air. The symbols on the ground seemed to glow faintly under the moonlight. As we chanted, the candles flickered wildly, and that familiar hum started up again. It grew louder, and soon it felt like the ground was vibrating beneath us. Suddenly, a blinding light filled the clearing. It was so bright that we had to shield our eyes. The hum reached a deafening pitch, and then, just as quickly as it had started, everything went silent and dark. When we opened our eyes, the candles were out, and the symbols had vanished. We looked around, bewildered. It seemed like nothing had happened. Mark and I exchanged nervous glances, unsure of what to do next. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something moving in the woods. It was a faint, almost imperceptible shimmer, like heat waves rising off the pavement on a hot day. We both froze, watching as the shimmer moved closer. "Do you see that?" Mark whispered, his voice trembling. "Yeah," I replied, barely audible. The shimmering figure stopped at the edge of the clearing. It seemed to be watching us, though it had no discernible eyes or features. We stood there, paralyzed with fear and curiosity. After what felt like an eternity, the figure slowly retreated back into the woods and disappeared. The sense of unease lingered, but there was also a strange feeling of relief. We quickly gathered our things and went back inside. Mark was visibly shaken, and so was I. We sat in the living room trying to process what had just happened. "Do you think it was an alien?" Mark asked, breaking the silence. "I don't know," I replied, "but whatever it was, it's real." We decided to take a break from the rituals and see if the strange occurrences would stop. But deep down, I knew this was just the beginning. I had opened a door to something beyond our understanding, and there was no going back. Hey everyone, thanks again for all the support and advice. Your encouragement has been incredibly helpful as I navigate this bizarre situation. If you haven't read parts 1 and 2, I recommend you do for the full story. Now, on to part 3. After the unsettling encounter in the backyard, Mark and I decided to lay low for a while. We hoped the strange occurrences would stop if we didn't engage with the ritual anymore. For a few days, everything seemed to return to normal. The symbols disappeared from my window, the tapping stopped, and I didn't feel like I was being watched. But just as we began to relax, things took a turn for the worse. It started with my dreams. They were vivid and disturbingly realistic. In the first dream, I was in my backyard again, standing in the same clearing where we performed the rituals. The air was thick with an otherworldly fog, and the symbols on the ground glowed faintly. As I stood there, a figure emerged from the fog, a tall, slender being with elongated limbs and large dark eyes. It didn't speak, but I could feel its presence, intense and probing, as if it was searching my mind. I woke up in a cold sweat, my heart pounding. It was just a dream, I told myself, but it felt so real. The next night, the dream returned, almost identical but more intense. The being came closer, and I felt an overwhelming sense of curiosity and dread. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. I could only watch as it reached out a hand towards me. I started keeping a journal of my dreams, noting down every detail I could remember. During the day, I felt drained and anxious, constantly looking over my shoulder. Mark tried to reassure me, but I could see the worry in his eyes too. One evening, as we were discussing the dreams, Mark suggested we look for answers in the ebook again. Maybe there was something we missed. Reluctantly, I agreed. We spent hours combing through the pages looking for anything that could explain what was happening. We found a section we had overlooked before, titled Interdimensional Communication. It described how certain rituals could open a link between our world and another dimension, allowing beings from that realm to interact with us. It warned that once the connection was established, it couldn't be easily severed. The realization hit us hard. We had unknowingly opened a door to another dimension, and the beings from that realm were now aware of us. The book mentioned that these beings were curious by nature but could be unpredictable. It advised summoners to maintain a respectful and cautious approach. We decided to try a cleansing ritual to close the connection. The instructions were simple. We needed sage, salt, and a white candle. We had to perform the ritual in the same place where we opened the connection and recite a chant to send the beings back to their dimension. That night, we gathered the materials and headed to the backyard. The air was still and the moon cast an eerie glow over the clearing. We arranged the items as instructed, forming a protective circle with the salt. We lit the sage and the candle, and I began to recite the chant. As I spoke the words, I felt a strange energy in the air, similar to the night we first performed the ritual. The symbols we had drawn began to glow faintly, and the hum returned, low and almost imperceptible. I continued chanting, focusing on the intent to close the connection and send the beings back. The candle flickered, and the air grew colder. The hum grew louder, and the ground seemed to vibrate beneath us. Just as the energy reached its peak, there was a blinding flash of light and everything went silent. We stood there, holding our breath, waiting for something to happen. But there was nothing. No hum, no lights, no symbols. It was as if the connection had been severed. We cleaned up the clearing and went back inside, exhausted but hopeful. That night I slept soundly for the first time in weeks, without any strange dreams or disturbances. The next few days were uneventful. The symbols didn't reappear, and the feeling of being watched faded away. It seemed like the cleansing ritual had worked. But just as we started to believe that things were back to normal, I received an email from an unknown sender. The subject line read, "You're not alone." I hesitated before opening it, a sense of dread washing over me. The email contained a single line. "The connection is never truly severed." Attached was a photo of the clearing in my backyard, taken from the perspective of the woods. In the photo, I could see the faint outline of a figure standing among the trees, watching. My heart pounded as I showed the email to Mark. We were both shaken, unsure of what to do next. It was clear that our actions had drawn the attention of something beyond our understanding, and it wasn't ready to let us go. After receiving that eerie email, Mark and I were on edge. We tried to go about our daily lives, but it was hard to shake off the feeling of being watched. The photo haunted us both, a constant reminder that something, or someone, was still out there, aware of us. We decided to beef up security around the house. We installed motion sensor lights in the backyard and set up cameras to monitor any activity. Mark also suggested we keep our phones with us at all times, ready to record or call for help if anything strange happened. For a few days, everything was quiet. The lights didn't go off, and the cameras didn't pick up anything unusual. But the sense of unease lingered, a constant undercurrent of fear that something was about to happen. One evening, as we were reviewing the camera footage, we noticed something odd. At around 3 a.m., one of the cameras picked up a faint, almost imperceptible flicker of light near the edge of the woods. It lasted only a few seconds, but it was enough to make our hearts race. We decided to investigate. Armed with flashlights and a sense of dread, we headed out to the backyard. The night was still, with only the sound of crickets and the occasional rustle of leaves. As we approached the spot where the light had appeared, I noticed something on the ground. A small metallic object, half buried in the dirt. I picked it up and examined it under the flashlight. It was a strange-looking device about the size of a smartphone, with an array of buttons and a small screen. There were no markings or labels, just a sleek, black surface. It looked like something straight out of a sci-fi movie. "What do you think it is?" Mark asked, peering over my shoulder. "I have no idea," I replied, "but it doesn't look like anything I've seen before." We decided to take the device inside and see if we could figure out what it was. Back in the living room, we placed it on the coffee table and stared at it, unsure of what to do next. "Maybe it's a communication device," Mark suggested. Like the ones described in the ebook. The thought sent a shiver down my spine. What if this was a way for the beings to communicate with us directly? The idea was both thrilling and terrifying. We spent the next few hours trying to figure out how the device worked. There were no obvious power buttons, but as we fiddled with it, the screen suddenly lit up, displaying a series of symbols, similar to the ones we had seen during the rituals. A moment later, a message appeared on the screen. "We are watching." Mark and I exchanged nervous glances. It was clear that whatever we had contacted was still very much aware of us. The question was, what did they want? We decided to respond. Using the symbols from the ebook, we painstakingly crafted a message. "What do you want from us?" We pressed a button that seemed like a send key and waited. Minutes ticked by, and just as we were about to give up, a new message appeared. Knowledge. The response was both vague and ominous. Knowledge about what? Why us? We had so many questions, but we weren't sure how to proceed. After some deliberation, we decided to ask another question. "Why are you here?" This time, the response came almost immediately. "To learn." It was clear that these beings were curious about us, much like we were about them. But their methods were unsettling, to say the least. We needed more information if we were going to understand what was happening and how to stop it. Over the next few days, we continued to communicate with the beings through the device. Their responses were cryptic, often more questions than answers. They seemed fascinated by human emotions, asking about fear, love, and curiosity. We did our best to provide answers without giving away too much, always mindful of the potential dangers. One night, as I was sitting alone in my room, the device lit up with a new message. "Show us." I stared at the screen, unsure of what they meant. Show them what? Before I could respond, the message changed. "Your world." A chill ran down my spine. It seemed like they wanted more than just answers. They wanted to see our world firsthand. The idea was both intriguing and terrifying. How could we possibly show them our world without putting ourselves at risk? I discussed it with Mark the next day, and we came up with a plan. We would use the device to record and send videos of our daily lives, hoping to satisfy their curiosity without exposing ourselves to danger. It was a risky move, but we were running out of options. We started with simple things, recording our morning routines, trips to the grocery store, and walks in the park. We sent the videos through the device, and the responses were always the same. More. As we continued, we noticed subtle changes around the house. Objects would move slightly, lights would flicker, and there was an ever-present feeling of being watched. It was clear that our actions were drawing their attention, but we had no choice but to keep going. One evening, as we were recording a video in the backyard, we noticed something strange. There at the edge of the woods was the shimmering figure we had seen before. It was closer this time, almost within reach. We froze, watching as it seemed to study us, its form shifting and flickering. Then, without warning, it vanished. We were left standing there, hearts pounding, unsure of what to do next. It was clear that the beings were becoming more curious, more daring. We needed to find a way to end this before things got out of hand. After our close encounter with the shimmering figure in the backyard, Mark and I knew we had to find a way to end this. The being's curiosity was growing, and we were afraid of what might happen if we didn't stop it. The device had become our primary means of communication with them, and we decided it was time to use it to our advantage. We spent hours researching methods to close the connection definitively. We found references to protective rituals in various folklore and modern paranormal studies. Combining what we learned with the ebook, we devised a final plan, a comprehensive cleansing ritual that would sever the link and send the beings back to their dimension. We needed specific items: sage, salt, a white candle, iron filings, and an amethyst crystal. We gathered everything and prepared for the ritual. The instructions required us to perform it at the exact time we had first opened the connection, midnight. That night, we set up in the backyard once more. The air was thick with tension, and the silence was almost oppressive. We created a protective circle with the salt, placed the candle in the center, and scattered the iron filings around it. The amethyst crystal sat beside the device, which was still powered on. I lit the candle and began chanting the cleansing words from the e-book, interspersed with the protective phrases we had found in our research. Mark stood beside me, holding the sage and wafting the smoke around the circle. As we chanted, the air seemed to thrum with energy. The symbols we had drawn earlier began to glow faintly, and the familiar hum filled the air. The device's screen lit up, displaying the symbols and then a series of messages. Stop. Why? Ignoring the messages, we continued the ritual. The candle flickered wildly and the ground beneath us trembled. The hum grew louder, almost deafening, and the air around us seemed to distort. Then the shimmering figure appeared at the edge of the clearing. It watched us, its form flickering and shifting. For a moment I felt a pang of guilt, as if we were betraying a curious friend. But I steeled myself, focusing on the task at hand. As the chant reached its crescendo, the figure began to move closer. The hum was almost unbearable, and the symbols glowed brightly, casting an eerie light over the clearing. We finished the chant, and in one final act I smashed the amethyst crystal against the ground. There was a blinding flash of light, and a powerful gust of wind swept through the clearing. The figure stopped, flickering violently before dissolving into the air. The hum ceased abruptly, leaving an almost painful silence in its wake. The candle's flame steadied, and the symbols faded into darkness. The device's screen went blank, and the energy in the air dissipated. We stood there, panting and shaken, but relieved. It felt like a weight had been lifted from our shoulders. The next few days were surprisingly normal. The sense of being watched was gone, the strange symbols didn't reappear, and the lights and objects in the house stayed put. It was as if a dark cloud had been lifted, and we could finally breathe easy. We decided to get rid of the device, burying it deep in the woods far from my house. We didn't want to risk anyone else finding it and going through the same ordeal. Life slowly returned to normal. Mark and I went back to our usual routines, but the experience left a lasting impression on both of us. We had delved into something far beyond our understanding and had come out the other side, wiser and warier. I still have the e-book tucked away in a drawer. Occasionally I pull it out and skim through the pages, a reminder of the strange adventure we lived through. I haven't touched any rituals since, and I don't plan to. If there's one thing I've learned from all this, it's to respect the unknown. Curiosity can lead to incredible discoveries, but it can also open doors better left closed. To anyone thinking of dabbling in the dark web or summoning anything from another realm, be careful. You never know what you might unleash. Thanks again for all your support and advice throughout this journey. Stay safe, everyone. Back in 2017, my best friend Josh and I stumbled upon what would turn out to be the investment of a lifetime. We were both tech enthusiasts, always tinkering with new gadgets and diving headfirst into the latest trends. It was during one of these tech binges that we discovered Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies. At the time, the idea of decentralized digital money seemed almost too good to be true, but something about it captured our imaginations. We pooled our savings and bought in early, just as the crypto boom was starting to take off. Fast forward a few months, and our modest investments had ballooned into a small fortune. Suddenly, we had more money than we knew what to do with. It was exhilarating, like living in a dream. We went from scraping by on entry-level tech jobs to having enough cash to start thinking seriously about our futures. That's when we decided to start our own companies. Josh went into tech development, building innovative software solutions that quickly found a niche market. I, on the other hand, decided to dive into a more traditional business model. I started a marketing firm, leveraging my knack for communication and strategy. Things were going well, really well, But as my company grew, so did the need for more employees. I was swamped, and the usual hiring processes were just too slow for my taste. One night, Josh and I were celebrating our success over a few beers at his place. We were reminiscing about our humble beginnings and the insane luck we'd had with our investments. That's when Josh, always the one to push boundaries and seek thrills, proposed a challenge. "You know what would be wild?" he said, his eyes twinkling mischievously. "Hiring someone off the dark web. Think about it, man. You need workers, right? And you're always complaining about how slow and boring the hiring process is. Why not spice things up?" I laughed it off at first. The dark web. It was the stuff of urban legends and horror stories. But the more we talked about it, the more it sounded like a dare I couldn't back down from. Josh knew how competitive I was, and he played on that perfectly. "Come on, don't chicken out," he teased. "You're always saying you're up for anything. Prove it. Just one employee. What's the worst that could happen?" In hindsight, there were a million ways I could have responded. I could have pointed out the risks, the legal implications, the sheer insanity of the idea. But instead, fueled by alcohol and the high of our recent success, I agreed. I couldn't let Josh think I was scared. After all, we'd taken risks before and come out on top. What was one more gamble? The next day, with a slight hangover and a lot of second thoughts, I began to seriously consider the challenge. I started researching the dark web, reading about how to access it and what to expect. It was a shadowy underworld, full of illicit activities and hidden dangers, but my curiosity was piqued. I told myself it was just an experiment, a one-time thing to prove a point. Little did I know, this reckless decision would lead me down a path far darker and more dangerous than I could ever have imagined. The thrill of the challenge blinded me to the potential consequences, and I was about to find out just how high the stakes could be when you play games with the dark web and the people who are on there. The first step in my ill-advised adventure was to download Tor, the software required to access the dark web. Tor stands for the Onion Router, and it promised layers of anonymity that would allow me to browse the darker corners of the internet undetected. The whole process felt like stepping into a spy movie. There was something thrilling and undeniably eerie about it. Once Tor was installed, I spent hours reading about how to stay safe on the dark web. I learned about the importance of using a VPN, creating a new untraceable email account, and never revealing personal information. I also read countless warnings about the dangers lurking in the shadows, hackers, scammers, and even worse. But with Josh's challenge ringing in my ears, I pushed those fears aside and pressed on. Navigating the dark web was like wandering through a labyrinth. The websites weren't as polished or user-friendly as those on the surface web. They had cryptic names and bizarre URLs ending in .onion, each one feeling like a doorway to something potentially sinister. I clicked through forums, marketplaces, and message boards, all the while feeling a growing sense of unease. Eventually, I found a site that seemed to fit the bill. It was a job board of sorts, with posts ranging from mundane freelance gigs to more questionable offers. The site was poorly designed, with dark backgrounds and neon green text that strained my eyes. It felt like a relic from the early days of the internet, but I guess that added to its authenticity. I created an account using the alias CryptoBoss87 and crafted a post. Title: Seeking Employee for Growing Marketing Firm. Description: Looking for a dedicated individual to join my team at a rapidly expanding marketing company. Competitive salary and benefits. Serious inquiries only. I hit post and sat back, feeling a mix of excitement and dread. Part of me expected nothing to come of it, but another part couldn't shake the feeling that I was opening a door that should remain closed. To my surprise, replies started trickling in within hours. Most were nonsensical or outright scams, but a few seemed legitimate, or as legitimate as anything could be in this context. The one that stood out was from a user named Lizards02. Subject: Re-seeking employee for growing marketing firm. Message: I'm interested in the position, have experience in digital marketing and SEO, willing to discuss further details. Let me know. There was something about the straightforwardness of the message that made me pause. It wasn't overly enthusiastic or desperate, just a simple expression of interest. Against my better judgment, I replied. Subject: seeking employee for growing marketing firm. Message: thanks for reaching out. Can you provide more details about your experience and current availability? Also, please let me know your expected salary range. We went back and forth for a bit, discussing the job requirements, the company's location, and the salary. I kept things vague, still wary of giving away too much information. Despite the odd circumstances, Lizard02 seemed professional enough. He claimed to have years of experience in digital marketing and provided some examples of his past work. After a few exchanges, we settled on a salary that was generous but not outrageous. I arranged for him to start the following week, feeling a strange mix of accomplishment and anxiety. Part of me was proud for stepping up to Josh's challenge, but another part couldn't shake the nagging feeling that I was inviting trouble into my life. As the start date approached, I found myself second-guessing the whole endeavor. But it was too late to back out now. The wheels were in motion, and I had to see it through. I tried to reassure myself that everything would be fine, that this was just an unconventional way of hiring a new employee. Yet deep down, I couldn't ignore the creeping sense of dread. What had I gotten myself into? The week passed in a blur of activity as I prepared for my new hire's arrival. I made sure the office was in top shape, arranged for a temporary desk, and briefed my team about the new addition, albeit leaving out the unconventional method through which he was hired. Josh kept checking in, his excitement over the whole situation adding to my already high levels of anxiety. The night before Lizard 2 was set to start, I received an encrypted message confirming our meeting. He would arrive at the office at 9 a.m. sharp. There was no turning back now. I felt a knot of tension in my stomach as I read the message over and over again. The prospect of meeting this mysterious figure from the dark web was both thrilling and terrifying. That morning I arrived at the office early. I made a point to have my bodyguards on high alert. Normally they were discreet, blending into the background, but today I instructed them to stay close. My intuition was screaming that something was off, but I couldn't pinpoint what. Better safe than sorry, I thought. At precisely 9 a.m., a tall, lanky man walked through the front door. He was dressed in a nondescript manner, wearing a black hoodie, jeans, and dark sunglasses. Despite his casual attire, there was an air of tension about him, like a coiled spring ready to snap. He introduced himself as Lizard02, his voice a low monotone, and handed me a resume that seemed oddly professional given the circumstances. We exchanged pleasantries, and I gave him a quick tour of the office. My employees cast curious glances our way, but I brushed it off, trying to maintain an air of normalcy. As we reached his desk, I went over the basic expectations and responsibilities. He nodded along, his expression unreadable behind those dark glasses. As we sat down to finalize some paperwork, the atmosphere shifted. His demeanor changed from polite and reserved to something far more menacing. Leaning forward, he dropped his voice to a threatening whisper. "I know how much you're worth," he said, a cold smile creeping across his face. "And I want a cut. A big one. Transfer me $500,000 by the end of the day, or things are going to get ugly." My heart raced. I tried to keep my composure, but fear gripped me. This was a nightmare scenario. I glanced around the office, hoping none of my employees had noticed the sudden change in tone. "You must be joking," I managed to say, trying to inject some firmness into my voice. "That's not happening." His smile widened. "I'm dead serious. And believe me, you don't want to find out what happens if you refuse." At that moment, my bodyguards, sensing the tension, stepped forward. Lizard 2 noticed them for the first time, and his confidence wavered. He stood up abruptly, knocking over his chair. "Think about it," he spat, turning to leave. But before he could take another step, my bodyguards were on him, restraining him quickly and efficiently. The office descended into chaos as my employees realized what was happening. I called the police immediately, my hands shaking. Within minutes, officers arrived and took Lizard 2 into custody. As they led him away, he glared at me, his eyes promising retribution. The office buzzed with confusion and fear. My employees were shaken, and I had to gather everyone to explain what had happened without revealing the full extent of my recklessness. I framed it as a security threat that had been neutralized thanks to our vigilance. That night, as I sat in my office, the adrenaline wearing off, I couldn't help but reflect on how close I had come to a potentially disastrous outcome. My gamble on the dark web had nearly cost me everything. The thrill of the challenge had blinded me to the very real dangers that lurked in the shadows. I called Josh to fill him in, his initial excitement turning to shock as I recounted the day's events. He admitted that maybe his challenge had gone too far, and we both agreed that this was a lesson we wouldn't soon forget. I was lucky this time. If my bodyguards hadn't been there, if security had been less stringent, who knows what might have happened. This brush with danger was a stark reminder of the perils of venturing into unknown and unregulated territories. The days following the incident with Lizard 2 were a whirlwind of activity and tension. The police conducted their investigation, and I had to provide numerous statements and documents to corroborate my story. My decision to hire someone off the dark web was kept under wraps, described simply as a security breach in official reports. The police assured me they would dig deeper into Lizard 2's background, but the whole experience left me rattled. In the meantime, I had to focus on damage control within my company. My employees were understandably shaken by the confrontation they had witnessed. I called a meeting to address their concerns, emphasizing the steps we were taking to ensure their safety. I reassured them that we were enhancing our security measures and that such an incident would not happen again. They seemed to accept my assurances, but the unease in the office was palpable. One evening, a few days after Lizard 2's arrest, I received a call from the police. They had uncovered some disturbing information. Lizard 2 was not just a disgruntled job seeker, but a known criminal with a history of extortion and violent threats. He had been operating under various aliases on the dark web, offering his services for nefarious activities. My ill-fated job post had merely put me on his radar. The revelation sent a chill down my spine. I realized how close I had come to real danger. Hiring someone from the dark web had been a reckless and naive gamble, one that could have cost me far more than just money. I felt a surge of anger at myself for allowing the situation to escalate to this point. It was a harsh wake-up call. I decided to implement a series of stringent security protocols in my company. We hired a professional security consultant to conduct a thorough review and overhaul of our systems. Background checks for new hires were intensified, and we installed advanced surveillance equipment throughout the office. My bodyguards, who had already proven their worth, were given more defined roles and responsibilities. In the midst of all this, Josh and I had a heart-to-heart conversation. He expressed genuine remorse for pushing me into the challenge, acknowledging that it had been a foolish and dangerous idea. We both agreed that our success had made us reckless, blinding us to the potential consequences of our actions. We resolved to be more cautious in the future, no longer allowing our wealth and curiosity to lead us into perilous situations. The ordeal also prompted me to reflect on my approach to business and life. I had always prided myself on being a risk-taker, someone who thrived on challenges and the thrill of the unknown. But this experience had shown me that not all risks are worth taking. Some doors are better left unopened, some challenges better left unmet. As the weeks passed, the office slowly returned to normal. The initial shock wore off, replaced by a renewed focus on our work and a sense of camaraderie among my employees. The incident had, in a strange way, brought us closer together. We were more vigilant, more supportive of one another, and more determined to succeed. One afternoon, as I was wrapping up for the day, I received a final update from the police. Lizard 2 had been formally charged and would face trial for his crimes. There was a sense of closure in knowing that justice would be served, but it also reinforced the lesson I had learned. The dark web is a dangerous place, and meddling with it comes at a high cost. I sat back in my chair, contemplating everything that had happened. The thrill of our cryptocurrency windfall, the excitement of starting my own company, the reckless challenge from Josh, all of it had led to this moment. I realized that my journey, while marked by success, had also been shaped by a reckless disregard for the potential dangers of the unknown. In the end, I had survived my brush with the dark web, but it had left a lasting impact. I knew I had to share my story, not just as a cautionary tale, but as a reminder to myself and others about the importance of making wise, informed decisions. The thrill of the unknown can be enticing, but it is often fraught with unseen dangers. As I turned off the lights in my office and headed home, I felt a sense of relief and resolution. I had learned a valuable lesson, one that would stay with me for the rest of my life. Looking back, the entire experience with Lizard 2 felt surreal, like a nightmare from which I'd just awoken. The thrill of the challenge, the tension of the encounter, and the subsequent fallout had left an indelible mark on me. It was a sobering reminder of how close I had come to jeopardizing everything I had worked so hard to build. With Lizard 2 behind bars and the office security tighter than ever, I began to focus on the future. But the lessons from this ordeal were never far from my mind. I found myself replaying the events over and over, dissecting my decisions and their consequences. I realized I had been reckless, letting my curiosity and competitive nature cloud my judgment. It was a hard truth to swallow, but it was necessary for my growth as a person and a business owner. In the weeks that followed, I took significant steps to ensure the safety and security of my company. We overhauled our hiring processes, implementing stringent background checks and multi-layered vetting procedures for new employees. The entire team received training on recognizing and reporting suspicious activities. I wanted to ensure that no stone was left unturned when it came to protecting my business and my employees. I also took the opportunity to strengthen our internal communication. Weekly meetings were established to keep everyone informed about ongoing security measures and to provide a platform for any concerns to be addressed promptly. The transparency helped to rebuild trust within the team, which had been shaken by the incident. One of the most impactful changes was the addition of a dedicated security officer to our staff. This new role was responsible for continuously monitoring our security protocols and ensuring we stayed ahead of potential threats. Having an expert on board provided peace of mind and underscored our commitment to safety. Despite the heightened security, the office atmosphere slowly returned to normal. The initial fear and anxiety subsided, replaced by a renewed sense of camaraderie and vigilance. My employees knew that we were taking their safety seriously, and their dedication to the company's success was stronger than ever. After posting my story on Reddit, the responses came pouring in. Many people thanked me for sharing and echoed my sentiments about the dangers of the dark web. Some shared their own harrowing experiences, while others expressed relief that I had come out of it unharmed. It felt cathartic to put it all out there, to turn a bad experience into a valuable lesson for others. In the end, the challenge from Josh, while reckless and dangerous, had taught me an invaluable lesson about the importance of caution and the real-world consequences of my actions. It reinforced the need to stay grounded and make decisions based on reason rather than thrill-seeking. My company continued to grow, and with the new security measures in place, my employees felt safer and more assured. The dark web was behind me, a chapter of my life closed with a clear resolution. But the lessons learned would stay with me forever, guiding me in both my personal and professional life. Life moved on, and so did I. But every now and then when I glanced at the dark web horror stories popping up on my feed, I couldn't help but shiver, knowing just how real those dangers were. My brush with the unknown had left me wiser, and for that, I was grateful. This experience had a profound impact on my personal life as well. I became more cautious and deliberate in my actions, always weighing the potential risks before making decisions. The reckless abandon of my earlier days was replaced with a thoughtful consideration of the consequences. Josh and I remained close friends, but our conversations took on a more serious tone. We both recognized that our initial success had led us to a dangerous level of overconfidence. The incident with Lizards 02 was a stark reminder that even in the face of success, humility and caution were paramount. As my company thrived and expanded, I often reflected on the journey that had brought me to this point. The lessons learned from the Dark Web Challenge were etched in my memory, serving as a constant reminder of the importance of security, vigilance, and responsible decision-making. In sharing my story, I hope to spare others from similar mistakes. The dark web is a dangerous place, full of unknown perils and unseen threats. It is not a playground for the curious or the reckless. My experience had shown me that some risks are simply not worth taking. With each passing day, the incident with Lizard 2 faded further into the background, but its impact on my life and my business remained. I had emerged from the ordeal stronger and wiser, with a renewed commitment to safeguarding what I had built. The dark web was a chapter I was happy to leave behind, but the lessons it taught me would stay with me forever. Hey Reddit, I'm a 21-year-old guy with a bit too much time on my hands. Like, way too much. You know how it is when you're in that weird limbo between finishing school and figuring out what you want to do with your life. That's where I am. I spend my days binge-watching shows, playing video games, and getting sucked into endless rabbit holes on the internet. And sometimes I do really stupid things just to kill the boredom. Lately, I've been hearing a lot about the dark web. You know, the stuff you see in movies and hear in hushed conversations, a place where you can supposedly find anything from illegal drugs to hitmen. I wasn't interested in any of that illegal stuff, honestly. I just wanted to see if it was as spooky and dangerous as everyone said. I mean, come on, the curiosity was killing me. So I started doing some research. I read about all the precautions you need to take before diving into that part of the internet. VPNs, Tor browser, all that jazz. I figured, why not? I've got nothing but time. Plus, if there's even a tiny chance I could stumble upon some creepy, mysterious corner of the web, it would make for a hell of a story. My friends thought I was nuts. They warned me about all the horror stories they'd heard. People getting hacked, tracked, or worse. But I shrugged it off. I'm careful, I told myself. I won't be looking for anything illegal. I just want to browse around, see what all the fuss is about. One night, I finally decided to take the plunge. I downloaded the Tor browser, set up a VPN, and took a deep breath. The excitement mixed with a hint of fear gave me an adrenaline rush. My heart pounded as I clicked that icon, opening a gateway to the unknown. As I navigated through the dark web, I felt a strange mix of disappointment and relief. Disappointment because, honestly, it wasn't as terrifying as I expected. No hitmen or secret cults popped up on my screen. Mostly, I found conspiracy theories, some weird news articles, and poorly edited alien photos. Relief because, well, it wasn't as terrifying as I expected. Nothing jumped out to grab me, and I didn't stumble upon anything I shouldn't have. It was like a forbidden playground that didn't live up to its reputation. But still, the feeling of doing something taboo was kind of thrilling. It felt like I was peeking behind a curtain that most people were too afraid to look behind, and I guess that was enough to satisfy my curiosity. For now. Little did I know, that night would be the start of something I never could have imagined. But I'll get to that in the next part. If you've got any questions about my first experience on the dark web, feel free to ask. And stay tuned because things are about to get a whole lot weirder. Alright, so after my initial dive into the dark web, I figured I'd explore a bit more. I wasn't looking for anything illegal or dangerous, just some weird and interesting stuff. You know, the kind of things you can't find on the regular internet. So I fired up my VPN and Tor browser again, feeling a bit more confident this time around. I started clicking on random links, bouncing from one bizarre site to another. Most of the stuff I came across was pretty tame, to be honest. There were a lot of conspiracy theory forums where people discussed everything from government cover-ups to alien invasions. Some of it was so outlandish that it was almost funny, like a live-action version of those crazy conspiracy videos on YouTube. I also found a few sites that claimed to have secret government documents, but they were either heavily redacted or obvious fakes. There were a lot of poorly edited photos of supposed UFO sightings and alien autopsies. Honestly, it was more cheesy than scary. I even found a site selling supposed ancient artifacts, but they looked like stuff you'd find in a tourist trap gift shop. As I kept browsing, I noticed a trend. Most of the sites were just plain weird, filled with people who seemed more like hobbyists than criminals. There were forums for people obsessed with cryptids like Bigfoot and the Loch Ness Monster, and others dedicated to debunking the moon landing. It was like a collection of the internet's most eccentric communities, all gathered in one place. I did come across a few disturbing things, though. There were some forums where people shared creepy stories and urban legends similar to what you'd find on Reddit. Some of the stories were really unsettling, but they seemed more like fiction than reality. Still, reading them in the context of the dark web gave them an eerie vibe. After a couple of hours of aimless clicking, I decided to call it a night. My curiosity was satisfied, and I hadn't found anything truly terrifying or dangerous. It felt like I had just scratched the surface of the dark web, but I wasn't in any hurry to dig deeper. Besides, I didn't want to push my luck. I logged off, feeling a mix of relief and anticlimax. Part of me was glad I didn't stumble upon anything horrific, but another part of me was a bit disappointed. The dark web wasn't the nightmare-inducing labyrinth I'd been led to believe. It was more like a bizarre, shadowy version of the regular internet. Over the next few days, I went back to my usual routine. I didn't think much about my dark web adventure, chalking it up to just another one of my impulsive decisions. Life went on as usual, and I put the whole thing out of my mind. But then, something strange happened. It started one night when I found a mysterious letter left at my door. The envelope was plain, with no return address. I opened it, expecting it to be some sort of junk mail or a prank. But the contents were odd. I won't get into the specifics of what was written inside, because, honestly, that's not the important part. At first I brushed it off. Maybe it was a prank from one of my friends who knew about my little dark web escapade. But then, a few days later, another letter showed up, and then another. They weren't threatening or anything, but there was something unsettling about them, something familiar that I couldn't quite put my finger on. I started to get this creeping feeling, like I was being watched. It was subtle at first, just a twinge of paranoia that I tried to ignore. But as the days went by and the letters kept coming, the feeling grew stronger. I couldn't shake the sense that something, or someone, was out there keeping tabs on me. And that's when I remembered the dark web. Could it be connected? Was someone messing with me because I dared to poke around where I didn't belong? The thought gnawed at me, but I had no way to prove it. All I had were these strange letters and a growing sense of unease. Hey Reddit, back again with the next part of my story. So like I mentioned before, it all started with those weird letters showing up at my door. The first one was easy enough to brush off, but after the second and third, I couldn't ignore them anymore. They were becoming a regular occurrence, showing up every few days. Each letter was handwritten on plain paper, and while the contents weren't exactly sinister, they had an unsettling familiarity that I couldn't place. I started to feel paranoid. I'd look over my shoulder whenever I left the house, and every creak or rustle outside my window at night made my heart race. I thought maybe I was just being dramatic, that the dark web adventure had messed with my head more than I realized. But the feeling wouldn't go away. One particularly restless night, I stayed up late trying to piece things together. I spread the letters out on my bed, examining each one for clues. The handwriting was neat but almost mechanical, like it had been written with deliberate care. It was bugging me that I couldn't figure out why it seemed so familiar. A few more days went by, and then another letter arrived. This time, it wasn't left at my door but slipped under it. That meant whoever was sending these letters had gotten close enough to my house to do it without me noticing. The thought made my skin crawl. I decided I needed to take action. I racked my brain for any connections I might have missed. Was someone pranking me? Could it be a friend who knew about my dark web curiosity? But none of my friends had handwriting like that. And besides, they would have cracked by now if it was a joke. This was something else. Then one afternoon I was cleaning out my garage. It was one of those tasks I'd been putting off forever, and I figured it might take my mind off things. The garage was a mess of old boxes and forgotten belongings. As I dug through the clutter, I stumbled upon an old family photo album. Curious, I flipped through it, smiling at the memories captured in the pictures. That's when I found it. Tucked between the pages was an old photograph of my grandma. She was young in the picture, maybe in her 20s. I turned it over and my heart stopped. There, on the back, was a message written in the same precise, neat handwriting as the letters I'd been receiving. I felt a cold wave of shock wash over me. How could this be? My grandma's handwriting was unmistakable. I'd seen it on countless birthday cards and letters growing up. But she had been missing for years. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. Could the letters be connected to her disappearance? I grabbed the letters from my room and compared them to the writing on the photo. It was a perfect match. The same loops and curls, the same careful spacing. My hands trembled as I held the pieces of paper. This was no coincidence. My grandma had vanished when I was 16. One day she was there, the next she was gone without a trace. The police had no leads, no clues, nothing. It was like she had just evaporated into thin air. My family had been devastated, and the mystery of her disappearance had haunted us ever since. Now, 5 years later, here was her handwriting, appearing out of nowhere in letters left at my door. It was impossible, but it was happening. I had to know more. Who was sending these letters? What did they want? And most importantly, what had happened to my grandma? That night, I barely slept. My mind was racing with questions and theories. Was someone playing a cruel joke? Or was there a deeper, darker truth behind these letters? The next morning, I knew what I had to do. I had to dig deeper, find out who was behind this and why they were sending me these messages. Hey Reddit, I'm back with another update. So after discovering that the handwriting on the letters matched my grandma's, I was in a state of shock. The connection was too strong to ignore. I needed to find out more, and the best place to start was with that old photograph I found in the garage. The next day I decided to take a closer look at the photo. I remembered that my grandma used to write little notes on the back of her pictures. Maybe there was something there that I had missed. As I examined the photograph again, I noticed something that made my heart skip a beat. Hidden in the corner of the note on the back was a date, 04/22/2000. It was faint, almost as if it had been an afterthought. I grabbed my laptop and started digging through old family documents and photos, looking for anything from around that time. I found a few more pictures and some of my grandma's old journals. As I read through her entries, I noticed something strange. In the weeks leading up to that date, her writing became more erratic, almost paranoid. She mentioned feeling like she was being watched, and there were several references to meeting someone she called H. The name didn't ring any bells, but the pattern was eerily familiar. It reminded me of the way I had been feeling lately, ever since the letters started showing up. I knew I had to figure out who H was and what connection they might have to my grandma's disappearance. I spent the next few days combing through every piece of information I could find. I reached out to family members, asking if they remembered anything unusual from that time. Most of them didn't recall much, but my aunt mentioned that my grandma had started acting strange and secretive a few months before she vanished. One evening, as I was going through some old boxes in the attic, I found something that made my blood run cold. It was an old diary, one I had never seen before. The cover was worn, and the pages were yellowed with age. Inside, the entries were written in the same neat, precise handwriting as the letters. It was my grandma's diary. I started reading, my hands trembling with anticipation. The entries began normally enough, but as I got closer to the date on the photograph, they became more and more disturbing. My grandma wrote about meeting H, and how he claimed to have knowledge about hidden truths and secrets. She mentioned feeling drawn to him, despite a growing sense of dread. In the final entry, dated 04/21/2000, she wrote about a meeting she had scheduled with H the next day. She sounded nervous, almost scared, but also determined. The entry ended abruptly with a cryptic note. He knows. He's been watching. Tomorrow, it all changes. That was the last entry. The next day, she was gone. I sat back, trying to process everything I had read. Who was this H? And what did he know that made my grandma disappear? The more I thought about it, the more I was convinced that the letters in my grandma's disappearance were connected. I decided to revisit the letters, looking for any hidden clues I might have missed. This time I noticed something that sent chills down my spine. Each letter contained a small, barely noticeable symbol at the bottom corner. They were different on each letter but looked like some sort of code or cipher. I spent hours trying to decipher the symbols, searching online for anything that might help. Finally, I found a forum where someone had posted a similar symbol, calling it an old cipher used by secret societies. The pieces were starting to come together, but I still had more questions than answers. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, just like my grandma had written in her diary. I knew I had to be careful, but I was more determined than ever to uncover the truth. The answers were out there, hidden in the shadows, and I was going to find them. Hey Reddit, back again with the final part of my story. Things have gotten pretty intense, and I'm hoping you all can help me make sense of what's happening. After discovering my grandma's diary and the coded symbols in the letters, I knew I was on the right track. I decided to take a break from my usual online activities and focus solely on solving this mystery. The sense of being watched hadn't gone away, but I tried to ignore it as best as I could. I spent hours online, digging through obscure forums and old websites, looking for any information about the cipher in the letters. One night, I stumbled upon a post in a deep web forum that looked promising. Someone had mentioned a similar cipher being used by a secretive group known as the Watchers. The post was old, but it had a few replies from people who seemed to know more. They talked about the Watchers being a shadowy organization that had been around for decades, maybe even longer. According to the forum, they were known for gathering information on people, especially those who showed an interest in hidden truths or secret knowledge. I couldn't help but wonder if my grandma had somehow gotten involved with them. Her diary entries about H and the sense of being watched all seemed to fit. But why had she disappeared? And why were they targeting me now? I decided to take a risk and post in the forum, asking for more information. A few days later, I got a private message from someone named Observer. They claimed to have information about the Watchers and offered to help me, but only if we could meet in person. I was skeptical, but at this point, I was desperate for answers. We agreed to meet at a coffee shop in a nearby town. I was nervous but also determined. When I arrived, a man in his late 30s was waiting for me. He introduced himself as Observer and quickly got to the point. He told me that the Watchers had been interested in my grandma because she had stumbled upon something she shouldn't have. According to him, she had found evidence of their activities and had been trying to expose them. That's why she had been meeting with H. He was a former member who had decided to help her. The more he talked, the more everything started to make sense. The letters, the feeling of being watched, the symbols, it all pointed to the Watchers. Observer warned me that they were very dangerous and that I needed to be careful. He gave me a small notebook filled with information and told me to read it thoroughly, then destroy it. As soon as I got home, I locked myself in my room and started reading. The notebook detailed the history of the Watchers, their methods, and their goals. It also had information about their members, including H. To my shock, H was actually Harold, an old friend of my grandma's who had vanished around the same time she did. According to the notebook, my grandma had managed to hide some of the evidence she'd found before she disappeared. The Watchers had been trying to find it ever since. The letters, the surveillance, it was all part of their effort to track down that evidence, and now they were focusing on me because they thought I might have it. I felt a mix of fear and determination. I needed to find whatever my grandma had hidden and use it to expose the Watchers. But I also knew I had to be careful. They were watching me just like they had watched her. In the days that followed, I started searching my house for anything my grandma might have hidden. I combed through old boxes, checked every nook and cranny, and even looked in the attic again. Finally, hidden inside an old book in the attic, I found it. A small, leather-bound journal. The journal contained notes, photos, and documents detailing the Watchers' activities. It was exactly the kind of evidence that could expose them. My grandma had done it. She had managed to hide it right under their noses. Now I had to decide what to do with it. I knew going to the authorities might not be safe, especially if the Watchers had connections there. I decided to scan and upload the contents of the journal to multiple secure locations online, sharing the links with trusted friends and members of the deep web community who were also against the Watchers. As I did this, I felt a strange sense of closure. My grandma's disappearance finally made sense, and I had the means to finish what she had started. But I also knew that I had to stay vigilant. The Watchers wouldn't give up easily, and I'd have to be careful from now on. So Reddit, that's my story. I've done what I can to expose the truth, and I'll keep fighting to make sure it stays out there. If you have any advice on staying safe or know more about the Watchers, please let me know. Thanks for sticking with me through this. Stay safe out there, everyone.